Welcome back in to the second part of the Virtual LAN lab. In this lab, we're going to set up a trunk between our two switches that we dealt with in the previous lab. And like any good engineer should do, we're going to verify that traffic actually goes across the trunk as we would expect them to. Now, for the purposes of this lab, I've configured one interface on my recording server here to have the IP address of 10.10.10.5, and I've configured an interface in a VirtualBox virtual machine bound to a different interface with an IP address of 10.10.10.10. Now, I've verified that I can't ping 10.10.10.5 from my VirtualBox machine, and of course the traffic doesn't go the other way, even though it's not listed here on this command window. So now that we've got everything configured, we've verified that right now it's broken, let's see if we can get these two crazy kids to talk to one another. So we'll minimize all this, we'll go back to our 2950, and as you'll recall, if we'll do show interface status on this guy, we see that Fast Ethernet 03 is actually connected to one of my network interfaces. I can't remember exactly which, but I know they're both connected on Fast Ethernet 03 on both of my switches. And it is currently in VLAN 30, and it's up and running. And if we go out here, we do show VLAN, and we're doing all of this just as verification that it's actually working the way we expect it to. We see VLAN 30 DMZ host is active, Fast Ethernet 03, and if we do show interface trunk, we see that we have no trunk interfaces between the two switches. Now, if you took a 2950 and a 2960 and hooked them up, they would actually negotiate a trunk, and I had to actually go in and break this trunk just so I could show you how it's set up, and I'll show you how I did that here in just a moment. Let's go over to the 2960 and let's verify that VLAN 30 is configured on this guy as well, which I don't believe it is, so we'll configure it up real quick. If we do show interface status, we see that Fast Ethernet 03 is connected. It is not in VLAN 30, it is in VLAN 1. So we'll go into config T, interface Fast Ethernet 0/3, switch port access VLAN 30. Of course, it creates VLAN 30 for us. And so now we have the same configuration on both switches. Let's verify that we don't have a trunk on this end, which we shouldn't. We don't have a trunk to anything on the 2960. So a lot of engineers will stop right here and go, well, I've got VLAN 30 configured on both switches. It should just work, right? So let's go back over here to my client. Try to ping 10.10.10.5. Well, this doesn't work. Why doesn't it work? Well, that's because even though the same VLAN is defined on both switches, the switches don't know to send the VLAN 30 traffic between the two switches. Now, if both of these hosts were in VLAN 1, it would work because, again, the VLAN 1 is not really trunked between the two switches, but the ports on both ends are set as access ports, and so the broadcasts and the traffic flows through that one link, even though it's not technically a trunk. So you'll recall from our discussion of trunking VLANs between switches about the dynamic mode and the options you have inside of the dynamic trunking mode, the auto and the desirable and so on and so forth. And you'll recall that auto means I will start a trunk if you want to start a trunk. Well, by default, the 2950 is set to desirable. The 2960 is set to auto. So since the 2950 desires to create a trunk, it sends the trunking packets out the interfaces pointing at the 2960. The 2960 says, oh, you want to start a trunk? I'll be a trunk port with you on these ports. Now, in order to break that, if I do show run interface Fast Ethernet 0/47, you see that I had to go in here and manually set switch port mode dynamic auto. And you'll recall that if it's auto on both ends, it will never negotiate a trunk port simply because they're both waiting for the other end to initiate it. I'll automatically set one up, but only if you desire to set one up. Now, I'm kind of old school. I don't prefer the automatic trunking configuration for a number of reasons. Number one is security. I don't want someone to just bring a switch into my network, plug it up to an access port, and if the switch port trunking mode is set to dynamic or set to desirable, then they suddenly get a trunk to every VLAN that that switch knows about. Another is just internal consistency. I want to specify which ports are configured as trunks and what VLANs go across them for security reasons, for sanity reasons. Again, in this particular version of the iOS on the 2950, the default is dynamic desirable, but what happens if you update to a later version of the iOS and it defaults to dynamic auto? Well, when you reboot that switch, your trunks don't come up, half your network goes away, and if you're doing this at 2 o'clock in the morning during off hours, you'll look at it and go, well, gee, why did my network just break in half? And now I get to go drive into the office at 2 o'clock in the morning and stand in a really hot server closet with a laptop and a console cable to figure out exactly what went wrong. So we're going to actually manually configure these trunk ports, and we're going to manually configure which VLANs can trunk across them for security reasons, and we'll do that in the next video.